Okay. Okay. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. All right, what we're going to be doing for you today, first off, we're going to be framing out exactly why on our side of the house, when you have unaffiliated smaller parties, we're going to have more focus on the actual policies that different parties bring to the table and less on simply what party you're affiliated with and party politics. Second, we're going to say why it's more likely that more smaller parties are going to be able to form and why there's more incentive to form coalitions. And finally, how we're going to get people from minority parties to still have some representation, even if they don't happen to have a majority vote on the federal level, or if the municipal needs of specific cities do not happen to align with the national agenda for the Democrat or for the Republican Party, and why the two-party system generally does fail. Okay, first off, on to the actual model of how our unaffiliated smaller parties is going to look like. We think that, in the most simple terms, to get a party on a municipal level to start running, you just need to have a threshold or a quota of enough people that can be voted in as representatives into your municipal house, all running under the same organization or platform. We think that the barrier of entry to actually run as an unaffiliated municipal party should be decently low, so that any citizen who wants to see tangible change or visible change that doesn't involve climbing up the entire federal party level scale is able to actively be able to start something in their own grassroots level. Secondly, just framing out how specific city needs don't always align. Go for it.
So how do you decide who gets elected? Is it the party that has a plurality of votes, or is it the coalition of parties that make up more than a majority?
How are we going to decide who gets elected? Unfortunately, we're not going for the most radical change here. We're just fitting in with what the current political system goes with, being first past the post. In the case, we're going with first past the post as to begin with. But in order to actually get stuff passed as a minority government, as we have right now, you still need to form allies with other political parties. You cannot start shit-slinging at your political opponents if you want to get stuff passed, if you want to actually be an effective government. Secondly, on to the specific city needs and how even if you're Democrat, even if, say, you have a Democrat majority on the federal level, on the state level, why that's still going to be a better option for you to have an unaffiliated third party on a municipal level. We think that for a federal, on a federal level or on a larger level, for a Democrat or Republican Party, they are still trying to appeal to as many people as possible. They are still trying to have a whole mainstream agenda. On the municipal level, however, the needs of the party may differ. They may be more specific than what the mainstream or what the appeal to the general mainstream on a federal campaigning level of the Democrat or the Republican Party wants to support. That looks like things like safe injection sites, policing, zoning laws, or things that are highly controversial. We doubt that the Republican or Democrat Party is going to start putting on the most leftist things onto the national scale. We think that this is more suited to municipal parties, where people who are actively impacted by these issues are more likely going to be able to deal with this in a more rational manner than just party identity. Furthermore, on to party identity and how we're going to get less identity politics on our side. So currently status quo in the US, if you are voting, you're either registered as a Democrat or you're registered as a Republican. And unfortunately, what this tends to happen is that this goes into your social circle as well. You tend to align with the political beliefs of people in your social circles. You are a Republican or you are a Democrat rather than just you believe in the policies or the platform of a specific political party. Okay. Why this is likely to ingratiate itself into the actual in-group or into the psyche of a person is because we think that the reason why people are less likely to look at the policy and just look at the party of the person that they're voting in is that in order to be a good Republican or to be a good Democrat, you must be able to support all the stuff that a Democrat candidate puts forward, or support all the stuff that a Republican candidate puts forward. EX, r/conservative. If you want to be a good Republican or to be seen as a good Republican and have social support and not be socially ostracized, you must support all the stuff that Trump or his cronies are bringing forth through either executive order or through Congress, because that contributes to your social identity. If it's tied to your friends, if it's tied to your family and people you want to impress and fit in with, you're more likely to want to agree with. Okay, so problems with this. You just simply lack room for nuance, since if people aren't even looking at the policies that your candidates are trying to pass, and the more so just looking for, I want to vote for a Democrat, that is a Democrat, therefore they shall be voted in, then that just leads to a lot less political discourse. People are not thinking of what they're voting for. They're simply voting according to party lines. On our side of the house, when you have unaffiliated parties, we think that people actually have different options for what they can vote in, and they're more likely to read what they're trying to vote for or read for policies rather than just read for people. Okay, on our side of the house, why we think it's going to be more likely to get better discourse through the formation of coalitions? We think that literally anything other than two-party system is going to be preferable. Why? Two-party system on status quo, you have Republicans who happen to be far right, and you have Democrats who happen to be center. You literally have nothing else that is farther left of center because there is no other viable party that is able to occupy the space. On our side of the house, when you have unaffiliated third parties, first off, we've already framed out why there's such low barriers to be able to enter as a municipal politician or enter as a municipal third party. Municipal unaffiliated third party, but we also think that the lower barrier to enter this area of politics actually goes even further. Since if you want to, say, make change on a bigger level through the Republican Party or through the Democrat Party, you have to schmooze your way up several levels of government because, unfortunately, politics is a lot about nepotism, who you know, rather than just what you know. We think that on an empirical level, if you're trying to move your way up the ranks of a smaller party like the NDP, you simply have less people to smooch through schmooze and kiss up to than you do if you're trying to make your way up in the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party. You simply have more people and as such, more networks, more party politics. Secondly, on our side of the house, we think people are more likely to get involved or to form these smaller unaffiliated parties in our side of the house since they're more likely to be able to see impact that is actually visible and actually tangible. If you're trying to work for a larger party, being Democrats or Republicans, it will take time to see the change that is actually going on. If there is an avenue on our side of the house where you're able to form an unaffiliated third party and actively enact change right on the ground level, we think more people are going to be involved in municipal politics. Okay. So what are the benefits of having things like coalitions? A, we must start playing nice with your opponents because if you want to get stuff passed through the House, you kind of have to have people from other parties like you cannot start shit-slinging and throwing insults as we currently see in U.S. politics. We think that you're probably going to see more compromise as well. We think that this is generally good for political discourse. We think that this encourages more people to start thinking about policies instead of just blindly voting for whoever matches their party line. We also think, again, that identity politics in religion, identity politics in the Democratic and Republican Party is generally worse, since once again this encourages groupthink for fear of social ostracism. So proud to propose.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. First, I want to contest what comes out of the Prime Minister in terms of parties and identity politics being so pernicious, and then I want to push forth 2 claims. Firstly, why large cities need get faster and more representative policies, and 2, why by complicating the election process within cities, you will decrease voter turnout and increase voter apathy. Firstly, the Prime Minister's model is really confusing. I'm not sure whether they're actually doing a first past the post or plurality form of voting, or whether they're going to do coalition voting, which does require the sum of the votes of all the parties in the coalition to attain over the majority. But I'll take their second, because if it is their first, in which it is first past the post, this is severely unrepresentative because of all the reasons they explain as to why vote splitting occurs. I think the elected party is likely to be only 20 or 30% of the total vote of the actual city because there are so many parties, and therefore under plurality system that's very unrepresentative and undemocratic. If they're talking about a sort of runoff system or a sort of coalition building, that has its own problems because it takes a long time and it delays policy, increases gridlock. I'll talk about that later. But more pertinently, they say why you get more identity politics at the point at which it is a two-party system within these large cities. First, they say Republicans and Democrats are very, very entrenched identities. I'm not sure why this is true on the municipal level. I think the margins on a municipal level are much smaller than the margins on a federal level because the types of policies that you're passing on a municipal level are those that tend to be more short-term, that tend to affect a smaller magnitude of people than the millions of people within the United States, and tend to have very, very fine margins. So I don't think it's the massive amount of polarization we see between Republicans and Democrats on a national level, but it tends to be more fine and more granular. The examples of this, for example, look like how much budgeting decision you make on how much welfare to pass on to people. Whether you decide to pursue this one public transit investment, or like, for example, I guess delay that and like instead build a few roads. Like the ultimate delta here is like not that large, and I think that the similarities between these two parties are probably quite closer than they are on a national level. But even if you don't buy that, I just don't think it's necessarily bad that we actually have less, like more identity politics if it streamlines the process of voting and actually allows people to feel more engaged on a municipal level, and which points like they would not have been very engaged otherwise. I think those two like pieces of framing are going to take down opening government. The first thing I'm going to prove is why large cities get faster policies and more representative policies. I want to frame that cities are in a very tenuous position that are different from national level politics, right? National level politics oftentimes take years and years to manifest. They require a lot of debating within the legislature. They're oftentimes very far-reaching and broad policies, such as like bans on abortion or like, I don't know, desegregation within the school board and things like that. I think on a city level, the sort of policies that are likely to be passed are those that affect the day-to-day operations, that affect the minute like lives of individuals on a very like quotidian basis, right? So it looks like, for example, like choosing which sort of like city programs to continue to uphold, whether to approve certain zoning regulations and things like that. And crucially, this is things that need to be done on a fast basis. You can't delay the approval of housing because that is going to leave thousands of people unhoused. You can't actually leave it up to the legislator to continually debate whether to pass a certain like transit policy or to build more lanes, because that means congestion increases and people's quality of lives get worse. You can't actually spend so much time debating whether or not we should reform the waste management system, at the point at which that's just going to mean people like houses are going to pile up with junk and things like that. The point I'm trying to make here is that I think the need for policies to be passed faster is more important than that of their side of the house to actually ensure that the policies are like representative of a large coalition of different voters, right? And note here, this weighs on two key metrics. The first is on the intensity that I explained to you before, right? The lives of people that need operations to continue on a smooth basis just get hampered at the point at which on their side of the house, coalition is extremely slow. It takes a lot of time for different parties, smaller parties especially, that have leverage when they're now crucially the swing votes in certain like municipalities, to be able to extract compromises and to make policies that everyone agrees on their side of the house. This is crucial in hampering the sort of development and the sort of acceleration of actual day-to-day policies that are likely to improve the quality of lives of people. Secondarily, I think on a principled level, I don't think it is the types or the types of policies in themselves that are important, but rather that the policies reflect the general democratic will of the constituents. So on our side of the house, because cities are changing really, really like often, because there's like a lot of population of inflow and outflow out of a city, I think the city's demographics and outlook, like what's the word, makeup, can change really, really rapidly between months and years. I think therefore is most important for the types of parties that are elected to actually best capture those preferences and be able to actually actualize those preferences into actual policies. I think on our side of the house, we get that better. The second claim I want to make under this argument is why we get more accountability, in case they want to spread something about these parties being really bad. I think parties serve as very good vectors of accountability compared to independent candidates. Note that opening government never engages with this sort of clash, right? Because when you get funding from like national parties, you necessarily now are going to have more oversight and more scrutiny on the actual sorts of policies that you actually pass, especially on the municipal level, where there's significantly less media scrutiny and accountability metrics compared to national levels. I think it is far likelier for candidates to engage in things like corruption or lobbying or not following through with promises. This crucially gets less likely to happen on our side of the house because national level parties don't want their municipal candidates to ruin their reputation by being embroiled in these sort of scandals. I think on their side of the house, when you let any independent candidate run, you necessarily lose out on these institutional checks and accountabilities, which means you get more frivolous spending, you get more corrupt acts, you get worse quality of life for individuals. Finally, on why this complicates the process and it deters a lot of people from actually voting in the first place. I want to first frame why people don't participate a lot in municipal elections. And note this is really crucial because they talk about representation, but it's also on their side of the house that they get the least amount of representation. One, there's less media attention on municipal elections to begin with because the magnitude of those elections are just smaller. Two, the municipal elections in and of themselves are seen as lower impact, right? Because they only impact a smaller number of people. Thirdly, there's a greater amount of time and monetary cost that people have to weigh between choosing to vote in a municipal election or continuing to work their jobs or take care of their children and things like that. At the point at which voter apathy is already quite high, I think you exacerbate this on their side of the House by significantly complicating the process through things like coalition building, through the implementation of more sophisticated forms of elections, like ranked choice voting or runoffs or things like that, whatever kind of model they want to talk about. But also crucially, I think just having more parties to study the platforms instead of having two established parties by which many people are already a registered voter of and can serve as an easy heuristic for them to understand and internalize the policies of, make it significantly more difficult for more people to actually want to participate. Note that on their side of the House, their candidates are not vetted by anyone. They're completely independent. On our side of the House, Republicans and Democrats go through primaries in which bad candidates are weeded out, so you only filter for the best, most trustworthy candidates. For all of those reasons, very proud to oppose.
I think a lot of people in the States are currently very unsatisfied with the policies that exist within their municipalities. But because of the existence of the two-party system and because of the use of heuristics that has been, normalized in the current political atmosphere, feel like they can't do anything to actually change their circumstances, even when these things really matter in their daily lives. I'll start with reputation and then talk about our case. The first thing that they say is that on a municipal level, the effect is smaller because it affects less people. I just want to point out one thing, which is that on one hand, they call these issues minute and insignificant, but then tell us about the importance of the policies themselves, right? We think these things do matter a lot in people's daily lives, whether or not we prioritize green space over new developments, whether or not that building is used as a safe injection site or a cultural site or something else entirely, like a police station entirely, right? I think a lot of these debates really matter to us and are the the things that shape our political discussions and matter a lot to people. They tell you then that identity politics allow people to be engaged on a municipal level, but I think this is something that is actively harmful because people haven't been able to feel like their votes are represented on that kind of scale, right? So that is to say, a lot of the things that you consider when you're voting, even on a municipal basis, is the things that are defined by the party lines of Democrat or Republican, and it's hard for people to know how to advocate for an alternative, which often exists if you're able to create the political atmosphere to foster those things. So we think that it's actually really important that we give people an avenue to express how they feel on these things that affect their daily lives, and this will lead to people having more faith in politics overall. They tell you that time matters and that less people will participate because it takes a lot of time. I don't think, first of all, that the trade-off for representation is actually that good, because even if you have a policy that passes super quickly, if people don't agree with that policy, if people don't feel like their municipalities are understanding the things that matter to them, then they're still not going to feel like they have a voice in politics or satisfied with the system at all. I think that's actually very harmful to the representation that exists. Lastly, they talk about accountability and the fact that there's primaries. A couple responses. I think first, because people are going to vote or are going to lean to vote for what they know, there's a burden on these smaller parties to actually prove themselves as free of corruption as possible, and also for each of those parties to hold one another to account to make sure that they're able to, succeed, gain legitimacy within those votes. Also, there are not primaries for municipal elections. What does Sophie tell you that is so important in her speech? First, that we're able to get more representative policy outcomes, which I think is the most important thing in this round. People often have needs that don't align with a specific party, but in the States, if one party loses, there's a significant portion of the population that's no longer represented. We think this is really important because specifically in municipalities, you have a better understanding of the issues that affect you. So investment into cultural artifacts might not matter in the overall US sense under a Republican government, but it could be a quite nonpartisan issue in a specific municipality that has a rich diaspora history or important cultural sites. And I think it's important that governments allow people the space to foster these discussions that might not align with the strong party discipline or whatever that the two major parties have on the national scale. For example, the Democrat agenda, since they need to campaign for the national stage, is less likely to support things like safe injection sites, even if people within that specific community think that they're really necessary for the well-being of people that they see on their day-to-day commute, for example. So we think there's a lot of gaps within democracy that can be filled through municipal voting, which are really important. Also, we think that they're likely to be more representative of people in general because it's very hard to break into politics when there are long networks that exist within the Democrat or Republican parties. We say that it's representative as long as you get a vote, but we would question the extent to which that's actually true, since it's very much people at the higher ups or like people who have existing connections who make the actual political decisions within those parties. We think more ideas for people to collectivize over means you don't have to cater to be as moderate as a leftist or as right-wing as a less radical conservative, and allow people to actually express their real policy desires.
Point.
Yeah.
If people's preferences in cities vary so much like you say, then coalitions will have to include many, many political parties. That means the policies that they tend to compromise on must be very watered down and aren't going to make major change.
I think that's fine, because we're able to get better discourse and political engagement, which then also improves the quality of representation. We think this looks like two things. The first is like better education and discussion on policies, right? These things are very hard to have when it's two parties that are diametrically opposed to one another, that tend to be focused more on the characteristics of the party members and the policies, when they have like strict party lines to adhere to. Smaller parties need to articulate their platform and differentiate themselves, but also allow for collaboration across different lines. So I think there's going to be a richer arena of discourse when different perspectives exist. This allows for more parties that advocate for specific things that are important for community members. So I imagine there would be like an environment-oriented party in a place like LA or coastal towns in dread of joining. And even if these parties don't end up being the ones that win, or there ends up being coalitions that are formed, I think you get a better prioritization of the different ideas that actually matter within that municipality. And that's something that, like, even if like every single time the Democrat wins, just like it would if these things didn't exist, it means it's something that is better like in terms of addressing the needs of the community. We also would stop people from specifically identifying as one party over another because they have more options that they could identify with. I think that just leads to more openness to engage in political discussion in the first place, and that's something that's important. We think, on the whole, maybe there's a delay that happens in politics, but we think that's something that's necessary in order to allow people to actually engage in like the good life that they think matters. And this is a principle that the United States cares a lot about. Cool.
The fantasy that government has and will continue to try to sell you on is the myth of democratic representation. I understand that I'll generalize like a pretty wide range of data here, but if it ran as a candidate, undecided would win probably the majority of U.S. elections. Voter turnout at the municipal level overwhelmingly has failed to exceed a threshold of 50% over the past however many years. And like the off season, when it is that the municipal election is not aligned with a broader federal or provincial election, it's rare to expect that it is that voter turnout is even going to exceed a threshold of like 30%. And the compromise to this has been the development of the two-party system, which obviously isn't perfect, and it can and probably should be criticized. But crucially, if it is that teams want to compete on the basis of who best increases political representation and engagement, that two-party system probably remains preferable to systems where it is the vast majority of people are just never going to vote at all. They're not going to know what options it is that they even have, and it is that they're not going to have the interest in voting. I want to talk about a couple of things. The first is the thing that it is that opening government identifies, which is the woe of an independent politician in having to compete with big established parties that have centralized all of the attention. They already have all of the networks and like links or whatever that allow them to be able to advertise themselves and like campaign to other people. Second thing I want to talk about is why it is that municipal voter turnout specifically is low. So why it is that like unaffiliated multi-party systems are probably not great if it is that we're looking to increase representation, but specifically at the municipal level, why it is that this is such an unsuitable policy. And then lastly, on why it is that this issue of voter apathy and lack of voter turnout specifically gets worse on their side of the house. On the first, what it is that I don't think government yet acknowledges is the reason why it is very difficult for local politicians to have to compete against these big established parties that have accumulated and centralized a lot of resources to be able to consistently reach their constituents. It is because it's very difficult to do that, and it generally requires like a large capital investment or just a lot of resource consolidation and collaboration to be able to do such a thing to begin with. On why it is that voter turnout at the municipal level is particularly low. Several reasons here. One, I know it sounds trivial, and in the debate sense, this is the sort of analysis that mostly gets skimmed over. But genuinely, people are busy with their own individual lives. Voting holidays are not sanctioned nationally yet in the U.S. It is that you are asking for quite a bit, not just for the person to have to take a day off of work to be able to show up at a voting station and to be able to send in their vote, but also to do what it is an opening government expects the average voter to do, which is look into the policies of each individual independent and unaffiliated system that it is that they have. If it is that we're to believe what it is the government is saying, and that it is that this is going to be a large amount of diversity, and it is that this is going to be very fresh. probably means that it is that they're going to have to look into different parties, different individuals, and the ways in which their policies and platforms are comparatively different every single election cycle. This is just not feasible for many people to be able to do, and it is that I think that it is that this problem gets even worse when it is that you aren't even cognizant or you aren't even aware of who is fucking running, because it is that those politicians are unable to surpass the noise or the threshold of being able to solicit your attention to begin with. And the second reason for this is, okay, I think it'll be easier to just say what it is that David has already said, but that it is that, municipal elections comparatively seem less important than civil or cultural issues that have been federalized and that affect many more people. The reason why it is so difficult to get information on municipal elections is just because of the death of local news and the rise of news deserts within the U.S. Many people have no consistent exposure to, the ongoings of community events for a couple of reasons. First is media consolidation. News outlets, TV stations, whatnot, have been bought out consistently by larger, established brands like Murdoch News or whatever, to where it is that there's no longer a focus on reporting community events, but more so more broad, generalizable regional events. Second thing is the shift of consumer preferences to online and digitized news, and also the subsequent shift of advertisers away to those platforms that have generally broader reach. So the reason that it is it's very expensive for a newspaper to remain in business is the way in which they primarily made money was not, maybe partially it was through subscriptions, but most of them were able to subsidize and monetize themselves through the provision of advertisements. Now, many businesses have learned that it is that their advertisements, the bang for their buck, probably goes a lot farther when it is that they're able to penetrate and solicit many different people at once, when instead of just a local community of people that read the news, which is already quite small. Yeah, sure.
When somebody goes into the ballot booth and votes a straight ticket for whoever they wanted to be president on the local ballot as well, do you think this causes them to actually be represented locally?
I think that it is preferable to, I think that it is preferable for them to be in the voter ballot box to, submit a vote for whoever it is that they want to be president, than for them to not do it because they don't know who it is that they could vote for, and it is that the people that are trying to appeal to them are just unable to reach them. Lastly, it's just the amount of competition for attention that I think exists within, not only the contemporary landscape, but even far before that. You have entire corporations and conglomerates that are solely dedicated towards getting your attention such that it is you spend money. And it is, I don't think that, some independent politician is going to be able to cut through all of that noise and, distract you, to be able to tell you about their great platform for how it is that they're going to make it such that the city now also collects compost instead of just recycling and garbage. All of those reasons are reasons why it is that municipal voter turnout is already low. Why does this get worse on their side of the house? Because the issue of information decentralization gets a lot worse when it is that there's no longer just two sources that it is you go to and compare, but instead several different sources or several different people that it is you have to compare. And it is that oftentimes you don't even know who those people are, because it is that it's difficult to be able to find out who is running, what their policy platforms are in a way that seems unbiased and in a way that seems comprehensive. Secondly, though, the reason, I suppose this goes back to the compromise of the whole two-party system thing. The reason why it is that this works out is because generally it is that you know who it is that you're voting for. When it is that I voted within my last, the provincial election, I had no fucking clue who the person that was representing my riding was. All I knew that it is that he was liberal, and it was a strategic vote because it meant that it is that not only provincially, but also on the federal level, that it is that this person would better be able to represent my interests at a national or federal level, and ensure that it is that the things that I think are really important, that are federal issues that affect many different people, are litigated or I suppose legislated in the ways in which I want them to be. When I just said, parties discipline is it's strict, but I don't think it's so rigid to where it is you cannot express any diversity of opinion that diverges from that party line. I think that it is that there probably is the room for a disagreement, but this broad trend of strong party discipline, or at least there being a party line, means that it is that people are generally aware of what it is that they are voting for, the stances that it is that the people that they are voting for actually represent. It means that it is that the barrier to participating within an election becomes a lot lower. Many people are more likely to show up and turn out because it is that they don't have to do all of this prerequisite research into who is it that I'm going to vote for? What is their individual policy platform? When it is they can just familiarize themselves with one party or two parties, which it is that they are probably already going to be, because it is that those are parties that also operate at the state or the federal level. For those reasons, proud to propose.
Brilliant. Thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the member of government in the back.
Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest mistake of opening government is they just assert that people will think about policies more or read about it more. This is not proven, especially given the opening opposition response that people are really busy and apathetic about local politics. The missing mechanism here is that there needs to be an incentive for politicians to actively reach out to people, to knock on doors, to send phone calls, to send mail explaining things like policy platforms. This is what's missing, and this is what we get when there are smaller parties rather than just the Democrats and Republicans. So the main extension will be on voter information and representation, why this gets better with smaller policies, why this is in and of itself good, but why this also leads to better policies being platformed, especially given that the National Party is no longer able to threaten and whip local representatives into certain policy stances that don't favor the local voters. So let's talk about voter information. In the status quo, there's very little incentive to reach out to voters because as a Democrat or Republican representative at the local level, and again, I don't think this is just mayoral elections. I think OO runs into the mistake of being like, there's only one Democrat that like controls all of like a certain state. There are city councils, right, which is where you get like a plurality or many different voices represented on something like a council. But anyway, I digress. Democrats and Republicans right now feel like they have very little margin for sway and are able to be very apathetic or focus on issues that the average voter does not really care about because they're probably going to win anyway. So an example of this is in a lot of big cities, people are naturally very progressive, right? So there's typically like, more progressive voters, and because a lot of people really don't like Republicans on like a national level because of like the way large media and interest groups portray them, they always will vote Democrat anyway, even if the Democrats at that local level aren't making that many progressive changes, aren't actually making things better for local people, right? So this leads Democratic council people into apathy. They know they will continuously get in power without needing to reach out, without needing to canvass, without needing to talk to the voters about how their preferences are updating over time. They will continue to get that basic turnout, OO tells you, of 30% to vote for them, right? I think voters are also more likely to be apathetic because if you're in a very right or left-leaning city, you feel like there's no point in voting for the other side, given the low turnout, given the fact that you've seen the Dems like win many years in plurality or majority in your council. You don't feel like there's much your local vote is actually going to do, right? And keep in mind that when there is like the voting structure is different, right? Because who actually ends up being platformed at the local level, if it's the Dems or Republicans, is like primary votes, right? Primary votes often aren't conducted by local people or voters. They're conducted by like the elites of the Dems and the Republicans. So there's further like lack of representation of basic voter needs, and it is more like the elites are kind of controlling who actually runs at the local level. Why do we think this changes with smaller parties? You are forced for smaller parties to reach out to voters to get to know what you're doing, using OO's mech against them, because people don't think about politics unless they're actively approached with it, unless someone comes up to them and says, you should care about whether this public transit project is built. You should care about whether daycare can be provided for subsidized amounts in your country, or in your city rather. When there are multiple parties, you no longer have safe voters that vote for you just because they reflect their perception of you on a national level. They think I'm Democratic at a national level, so I will vote Democrat locally. You are forced to tell them what you actually stand for, right? So as a left-leaning candidate, you're no longer to have a super safe seat and like without making any status quo change and still get elected, because now you represent a smaller party and people don't actually know what you stand for. They don't know what the Change Party or the People's Party or the Green Party stands for. So as a politician, you have to go out and talk to voters, to shake voters' hands, to do barbecues where you listen to what the community wants. This is in and of itself good because it means voters feel more outreach to, which means they think and they are more likely to be engaged in local politics to begin with because there's someone actually talking to them rather than just assuming that they will vote for them. But also, it is good because you actually get politicians to hear what local voters want. The local voters can tell them, I want cheaper utility bills. I want a better daycare system for my child. I want et cetera, right? So this inherently gives us more representation. I think we quickly want to weigh this against the opening opposition turnout point. They never explain to us why turnout is in and of itself good when people are completely uninformed about what the representative is likely to do at the local level and are just voting based on their perception of a Democrat at the national level, right? When you're uninformed and you just vote for the sake of turning out, we don't see why this accomplishes any of the goals of democracy, which is to represent people's interests, to make sure life is better for people. This doesn't happen when you just turn out and you don't think consciously about what you're voting for, and you don't hold this politician to account to actually get the policies they say they will do passed in general. Not right now. The next thing I want to talk about is, again, how much the National Party actually forces local representatives in the status quo to do certain things at the national level. As someone who is running for like a council position and is affiliated with the Democrats, I am constantly actively told, if you don't do things that are in alignment with the broader Democrat Party or the broader Republican Party, we will run another candidate in the next primary election and you will lose your job. This is the reason why local council people are forced to staunchly follow the stance of the National Party, even if it is against the interests of local voters. An example of this is in places like, there's a lot of right-wing places or Republican-ruled like cities that don't have free pre-K, even though with a case study of free pre-K being introduced in Arkansas, which is one of the most like right-leaning states, and a lot of people actually being in favor of it, this is something that will just never happen if there's just Democrats and Republicans being forced by local, like national level pressures to follow the national politics. Because you'd be like, hey, as a Republican platform, you're never allowed to introduce something as crazy as free pre-K because that is against our national interests of small government stances, right? So that means you don't get local, like politicians even daring to put forward policies that are actually going to be good for local people. I'll quickly take opening.
The problem is that voter outreach costs money, which a lot of independent or unaffiliated politicians are unable to up themselves. How much more representation do you realistically have when it's limited to people that are able to bankroll their own personal?
I think in big cities, there are still going to be things like donors. There are still going to be a lot of like local fundraising that is possible, right? Like a big city like New York or like Seattle, probably it's not like some middle of nowhere city that has no money, right? There's still like politics in New York or in Seattle affects tens of thousands of companies, of workers, of like people that actively have vested interest in making sure politicians do what they want. This is where funding comes from. This is where like that type of thing comes from. Okay, so with smaller parties, because you are not burdened by the national like Republican or Democratic Party telling you you cannot do this or else we will literally make you lose your job, you are more able to switch what you run on from election to election based on what you are hearing from the voters. Based on if voters tell you, I would actually like subsidized pre-K, you are able to run on an actual platform that provides subsidized pre-K and people hold you to account on that because there's no longer safe voters. So you not only have to tell people what you are running on, they feel engaged in the political process. They vote for things and platform things that they actually want. We get those policies passed because of accountability and you no longer feel like you have a safe seat and you're able to then get more representation in politics, which is good. Proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the member of opposition.
Based on how this round has been going so far, we feel like much of it is very symmetric. We feel like electoral incentives to have good policies and campaign on them are pretty symmetric. It's very unrealistic to say, well, Democrats have to always support the Democratic Party. Like, who's that guy? Eric Adams. He's disagreeing with the Democrats on immigration, for example, and nobody cares. So I don't think that's real. Also, voter apathy is probably somewhat symmetric because nobody cares about municipal elections anyway. This is illustrated by Canada because, as you can see, Montreal, Vancouver, nothing really happened. So, what is our unique extension here? It is that this specifically would not work in America. Now, there's two types of parties that we need to talk about here. The main party that will be in control will be unions. It will be the trickle down of, former labor unions, and I'll explain to you why in a second. And then the second party, the second group of actors, is kind of more niche radical parties that's also going to be really bad. So 7 reasons for why unions are the likely counterfactual. First, they already have large formal membership. It's very easy to transfer voters. It's at least 20% of the vote. You're pretty much guaranteed because so many people are employed in those fields. These unions have a revealed preference for engaging in politics and trying to influence it in various ways. They'll probably will get involved given the opportunity and are only locked out now because of systemic issues. Thirdly, they currently employ representatives who are very media trained. So this means that they have a first player advantage. They are able to get on the field first, and people will likely associate them, primarily with the main party. Fourth, they're overwhelmingly perceived as being very positive for 2 reasons. First, media tends to romanticize unions quite a bit. But also, a lot of people have family in unions. They have an overall positive perception of them. So given the opportunity, they're likely going to choose unions, which are going to market themselves probably really well. There's probably also Because people who are not like in unions, people who are not party members, as has been established, have a lot less incentive to vote in general if they are not like a registered Republican or Democrat or whatever, something that is like part of their identity where they necessarily vote on it. So that means that unions have a unique advantage here to actually get like more supporters. And you also get a very like direct return on investment to actually, do this stuff, to invest a lot of money into it, because you have a very clear like return on investment. If you get consistent turnout, then you can get more stuff for your union, and this is what they want. This is the primary delta between Canada and America. So I'm going to present to you like a main case, our main push is about how this will result in like a poor use of resources, a lot of irresponsible spending, probably also a lot of gridlock and a lot of corruption. So first on gridlock and corruption, unions are likely to prioritize their own sector. So this looks like iron workers who want a railroad, and then construction workers who want a road, and so they will argue about that for 2 years, because that's literally all they care about. And there's also, there's a lack of electoral incentives that actually pressures them to change, because all their voters want is to be, to have their worker needs represented by the union. There's also a lack of transparency. So there's no actual like mechanism that they have to follow, where in the counterfactual, you do have to report to like a higher party who cares about long-term things like winning, large elections. They care about their reputation and stuff like that. They care about electoral incentives. So they actually have like more transparency, at least within the party, to actually keep this stuff under check. And also you have, they don't fear like bad long-term consequences, because they'll keep getting voted in by the people who profit from that. And so overall, you get like a really big drain on resources. You don't talk about stuff that actually matters very much, and it takes a really long time to actually pass policies. Next, it's also whatever party's coalition is in power, they're going to prioritize projects that cost a lot of money. A couple of reasons for this. First, cities are overwhelmingly composed of poor people that don't spend enough, on things like infrastructure. So things that most people care about are like, they want more money. It's very like difficult to survive in a city now. So that means that candidates are likely to cater to these types of voters overwhelmingly. Also, like unions overwhelmingly prioritize like working class people. So that will probably keep going on. And third, it is extremely easy to make these kinds of promises, because it's like very easy to overspend the budget for like some time, or to borrow, for example, or to temporarily follow through on these promises. The issue is, first of all, when you have like a lot of money in the game on like spending on different projects, this attracts a lot of corruption. It is also very unsustainable in the long run. However, there's a capacity to conceal this in the short term, which makes it a lot harder to address. This also like compounds because you get a lot more migration than into cities, because they're spending more on like poor people, so more people want to profit from that. And then this is additionally bad for rural areas, because this causes like more brain drain there, and this is bad. In the counterfactual, parties care a lot more about the long term. They actually care about like balancing the budget, making sure there's no like long-term debt and stuff like that. Secondly, also, you get like more cults of personality. So a couple of reasons. People who are going to run in these kinds of elections are likely going to be local heroes who like want to memorialize themselves. They want to like, aggrandize themselves. Because, if they really wanted to get involved in politics, typically they would go into like a Democratic Party or the Republican Party. The fact that there is a ceiling to like the amount of advancement that you have means that, or I'll take POIs.
If there's a bunch of unions, won't they argue against each other and hold each other to account? And isn't it good that we discuss the various issues that exist in a municipality?
They will argue. I don't think they'll hold each other accountable. I don't see why that would happen. You also probably get, people are really desperate. They tend to like want strong leaders a lot more. And because Democratic politicians or Republicans that are, running in these municipal elections are a lot lower on the totem pole, they have much lower ambitions usually. They're a lot less like Machiavellian level evil. They have like less personal money that they can spend. Third, you just get like more radicalism probably, because the niche parties that don't have the union access need to like stand out. They'll probably do more radical ideologies. It will probably be also overwhelmingly like leftist. Cities are overwhelmingly leftist. This is really bad because it increases right-wing radicalism. You're gonna have like a very small like KKK party, and then they're gonna like terrorize the streets, like guaranteed. Like this increase in radicalism in the common discourse is going to reflect on like regular life with normal people. And so overall, we feel like overwhelmingly, this wouldn't work in America, primarily because the types of parties that would get in at the beginning would be these parties that would be very corrupt, likely to do gridlock, don't actually care about the voters themselves, and for these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Brilliant. I thank the speaker for their remarks. Call on the witness in this case here.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, as a voter in a city, I already know that my vote does absolutely nothing because the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is already going to win. What does it matter if I vote in a general election to cause maybe some marginal change in like how much one wins by? As a politician, I need to buy into the two-party system or I literally will not have a job, because you can only get a job even in municipal politics in the United States if you like buy into either the Democratic or the Republican Party. What do you ask somebody to do if they are so passionate about creating change in their community and they just want to benefit the people they see hurting around them, but they do not align with either party? Are they supposed to just not go into politics at all? I don't think this is an ideal system. On our side of the House, we allow these people to get into politics. We allow those voters who currently feel disenfranchised to get representation. And I think this is an incredibly important impact because we uniquely explain how this actually achieves the benefit of representation. That being, like, less voter apathy, that being better policies that better respond to what local voters actually want, that being people even just feeling as though they are represented. This being people who know that they have no choice but to live in the city because they do not have the capacity to move away, feeling as though they have some control over the way the government behaves, and as though they have some way to actualize what they believe they ought to see about their city through the political system. Okay, I'm going to first talk about CO very quickly, then go OO and OG. CO brings a few points that I'm going to address. The first is the short-term versus long-term thing, basically saying that you don't have long-term incentives. I don't think there is going to be a significant amount of corruption for a few reasons. First of all, there are a lot of mechanisms that prevent this. I will note to all of opposition's points about corruption, this is illegal. Corruption is still not possible because it is still, like, illegal to happen. There are elections boards preventing corruption in elections. There are bureaucracies in cities that stop incredibly unsustainable policies. If a political party tries to forward a policy that does not work in the long term, this will be pointed out by the city bureaucracy, who often has literal power to stop them. It will also potentially be taken down by the federal level, the state level, the courts. There are so many checks and balances to prevent this kind of thing. But even if this is true, the Democrats and the Republicans also often have short-term incentives, especially in districts where they are having to fight against each other, where they are trying to win the next contested election against each other. But even if it is a safe seat, whichever politician is in power needs to try to win that primary. They need to try to do that to keep their fucking job. And they are probably going to forward the exact same level of short-term incentives, even if you buy that this is going to happen. And if you don't buy that, they have a smaller amount of money than any federal or provincial level would, so the amount of harm that they are able to do to the city budget is relatively minimal. You can still have the feds or the state step in to fix this. The other argument that CO gives you is on radicalism. I think it is generally difficult to generate enough energy around local issues to get any sort of significant impact, even in our absolute worst case. There's not going to be a KKK party because you are not going to be able to generate enough support for that kind of thing at the local level, especially because a lot of the people who believe in radicalism are not going to be that engaged in local politics in the first place and are probably going to care more about federal and provincial level issues such as immigration, such as like I don't know, whatever like racial talking points they have. They're not caring about garbage routes and street construction and that kind of thing. But I also think even if there is, the amount of harm that a couple councillors from a KKK party would be able to do to a local government is minimal. This is pretty self-evident because they will not have that much power. What are they going to do? Change the garbage routes to avoid immigrants? Probably not. Okay, now on opening opposition. They give you 1 point on representation, which I'm going to break down into 3. Turnout, corruption, and accountability. accountability and flip all of it. I will note on their point on turnout, the response to my POI indicates that the terminal impact of opening opposition here starts and ends with turnout itself. They never prove why this is a good thing inherently in and of itself. What we tell you is that we get benefits towards the reasons why turnout is actually valuable in the first place. There's a few reasons why, we beat them on their own metric here. First of all, people who care enough and are affected by local issues are always going to vote. This is because they're literally, it matters to them. They always have the incentive to vote. They do not need a party to vote for the issue they care about. Municipal elections already has, as opening opposition points out, very low turnout. It only jumps up as they note if the presidential election is happening simultaneously. What does this mean, panel? The additional people who are voting are only voting because the presidential election is happening. They are not likely to suddenly take interest in municipal politics. As OO mentions, they have busy lives. They are just going to vote straight ticket. They are voting for a Democratic president, so they are going to vote for a Democratic local official. We do not think this is true representation because they are not voting for a municipal candidate that actually reflects their or anyone's interests. They are simply voting for president and then voting by this, down the line. But third, even if turnout is lower, this is fine because we would rather have people staying home than turning out to vote based on something that is genuinely unrepresentative, i.e. what party this person holds, rather than any policy they actually believe in. And fourth, politicians, in order to keep their job, as Sherry tells you, are going to have to try to energize and reach out to people more. This is how we flip the turnout point. Yes, turnout is probably lower, but politicians know this. They need that turnout to win their election, so they are going to fight to get that turnout. They're going to get out there in the city center talking to people. People are going to feel more represented. Politicians are going to hear the interests of people. This results in better policies. This results in people feeling more connected to their government. This results in less voter apathy. All of our terminal impacts that I flagged at the start of this speech. On the point about corruption, this is illegal. Local elections boards regulate this. Accountability. What the OO argument proves on accountability is that the federal party has control over local candidates. We flip this. I don't think the federal party is going to be going in there and trying to focus on keeping the local candidates accountable to some altruistic idea of what they ought to be doing. What they are going to be doing is trying to keep them accountable and in check with what the federal party wants them to do, which is not necessarily beneficial to the voters. In a place, for example, which will benefit from investment in green infrastructure, but if it is significantly Republican for federal level issues, how is a Republican candidate voted in, because it is a safe seat, supposed to represent the genuine interests of this community, given that they are constantly having the national level party breathing down their neck, telling them to oppose these policies? As for OG, we explained better how politicians act differently. The threats of party pushback are more realistic than the mechanizations they give. So proud to propose.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. So starting off with the responses to CG, a few things. Firstly, they tell you that this is illegal. I'm going to respond to this very quickly. When you move things to a very grassroots level, when I'm a politician talking to other organizations on a very small level, corruption is really easy to happen. I think it's reasonable to say it's illegal, and some people might be perturbed. But I think, compared to large organizations, the Democrats versus Republicans, vetting happens much more. There are much more checks and balances, and I think this is a clear comparison why these are less likely to be corrupt. But also, you guys say yourself that the way you get money is to go find donors, because presumably they exist. Talk to people at a grassroots level. I think this is very easy to lead to a lot of corruption, given that you have such an incentive to also to get this money in ways that are probably questionable. I also think even at a high level in Republican Democratic parties, there's some level of corruption. Just it being illegal doesn't automatically get rid of it. I think especially when it's a union, which is what Mary's able to prove reasonably for a lot of cities, then it's also quite likely that corruption would happen at this level, given that there's only really one large party and they have very little checking mechanisms. Also, you also are very likely to overpromise and not deliver, given that you're much more short-termist. I think the Republican Party has very clear long-term goals, and even in a lot of these cities, where they have slightly different goals, it's still much better plan because they have much more resources. On the idea that the large Republicans and Democrats also have radical policies, I think firstly this is tight with their own case, because you've also claimed that voter apathy is kind of your entire case, and that Republicans and Democrats do nothing because everyone just votes Democrats. So I think most people do, in fact, vote Republican and Democrats in different cities for representation because they do have different policies and they do have the incentive to get the votes from these cities, given that cities are such a large majority of the population. It's a very dense, a lot of people there. Next thing, presumably these parties still have more resources and like better long-term goals, better accountability, better vetting. It's like definitely marginally much less corruption. Also, they tell you that people who care enough will always vote, and that this is already like really low. I'm kind of unclear. So to summarize CG, I don't think they are able to beat out corruption. I think this by itself puts us over them. I also don't think I don't really understand what their whole case on representation is. Presumably, if I'm like getting represented and like, sure, I'm able to check off a name, but I'm less informed. I've been likely lied to. I'm voting for people who are more likely to actively harm your city. I think this is probably worse, even if you're able to vote for someone who supposedly speaks out for your what you care about. Yeah, a lot of incentives for corruption, given you're at a very low level. A lot of the people who are in these parties haven't gotten used to like the rules of democratic parties and the large parties who have a lot more attention on them, and also you just have less attention. Okay, moving on to OG. First thing is just I think they can see that it's unlikely any party's going to gain enough attention to represent any people really well, given that it's likely to be very fractured and it's probably like a coalition government. No, thank you. So I think their one last claim. Yeah, I don't think they prove that people will meaningfully vote for these local governments, considering that, again, Republican and Democrats will continue to get a lot of votes, even at these municipal levels. I also think OG, concedes it's unlikely any of them will gain power, given that this is a coalition government. So I think their last claim is just discourse, and that this is, like, generally good. I think, firstly, these parties are very poor in the amount of resources they have to be able to reach people, so it's very likely that, like, most of the parties either do just not get a lot of attention out there, not able to talk to a lot of people who are like actually important that they're trying to reach, but also if they are and they're able to get a lot of money, this just raises the incentives for corruption and the likelihood that this happens. I also think discourse at this level isn't good. I think O is able to mostly take this out because most people are just like single dual issue voters. They aren't able to vote weighing like every single option out there, and even if there are like some really niche party that's able to have exactly the right policies you want, they never prove capacity for these parties to be able to unlock any of these benefits, given that there's going to be so much, gridlock and just like infighting within these government structures, so maybe there's just like a margin in people being able to vote for parties that like better represent them slightly, but I think not a lot is going to get done. I also think more importantly, this just discourages a lot of people from actually voting in these level governments, but then also at higher level governments, given that there's just so much more information. I think the only really important impact from this left is I think a lot of these policies will make really radical promises to gain votes, given that they have much less checking. I think this is a clear margin. And so a lot of people just likely lose trust in general. Sorry, I forgot one thing on CG. They tell you that city bureaucracy has the power to stop like a lot of bad policy and checks and balances. I just want to ask, these checks and balances are very much definitely swayed by Republican and Democratic government parties. So it's like unclear how they get any change. I think when Mary tells you that unions have a lot of power, have a lot of support, and they're likely to be the coalition groups that get into power, I think they're clearly able to have a lot of sway, even at the local city level, but even at higher levels, given that there's lots of unions in general, but then also they're quite large because like there's so many labor workers. I think a lot of these corruption arguments are much clearer on CO than like OO, given like the harms we prove are pretty reasonable. It's just like much more radicalism in general because more educated people are exposed to radical views. I think the impacts we prove are like much stronger than OO. Right, the drain on resources is pretty clear. A lot of these governments are union coalitions are going to make really like big promises or focus on goals that don't align well with the rest of the people. I think this is probably worse because, at least when you have Republican and Democrat municipal level governments, they're able to generally need the support of everyone and make policy that's generally good for everyone. I think union governments, sure, closer.
Okay, so we win against OG, but also everyone else in this round because we better explain why politicians are currently not accountable to voters and why they have other interests, such as big party do bad thing to them, that like will affect their interests. We align politicians' incentives with voters, and we force them to engage voters.
I'll deal with this in a second. I think maybe you'd be OG. Just further on the impacting corruption, I think yeah, again, the only response we get from this is that it's illegal. I think unions have just a lot of power. They have a lot of sway. They have a lot of supporters who buy in at like a very low level. I think Mary tells you like most families are generally in support of this, so they're very likely to support union municipal governments. I think overspending is very likely to happen for very poor reasons. I think they're unlikely to make good planning. They're unlikely to consider a lot of like benefits with other cities like municipal Republican governments will do. And again, they're not really good at long-term planning just because they don't have the resources and like institutional knowledge. Just lastly, a response to that, I don't think you're able to get like much representation considering the policies that so-called these parties are able to do won't actually ever go into power, given that it's very likely to be corrupt and just done very poorly. Also, just a lot of infighting, and I don't think this is ever going to happen. Very proud to oppose.
Brilliant. I thank the speaker for the remarks. Thank everyone for an excellent round of debate. This round is closed. Adjudication. This round is over.
Okay, yeah. So my call is the first to CG, the fourth to CO, and I'm amenable between OGO and the 2-3, leaning OG.
Okay, so roughly CG, OG, OOCO. Nimai?
I have OG, CO, OOCG.
Sorry, OG, CO?
Yeah, OOCG.
OOCG. Okay. I have a very similar call to Guo, so I have CG, OG, OOCO. I think the front half is the closest split, but I'm narrowly leaning OG. Okay, so Nimai, you are the most different, specifically in your positioning of closing government. So let's start with what do you buy from what do you not buy from closing government? Why do you think every other team in the round beats them?
Cool. I think my main issue with the CG push is just that, one, they say that single parties are way stronger in local elections and that votes are then useless. I think the problem with their initial sort of framing or like conceptualization of this is just that given a strong preference for one party over the other that would exist in a large city, that people generally are kind of okay with whatever the party does. I think there's already a conception within this debate that the differentiation between candidates individually at OO frames this as like a primary, OG says primaries don't exist, but at the very least, there's a range of candidates that are more meaningfully encapsulated within each sort of political party. At that point, they don't prove to me meaningfully enough why differentiation between each candidate is unlikely independently, or why people, I think, are likely to care about that differentiation absent, given that the same party that they say is already going to be elected. At that point, the margin of why people are less invested in local politics, to me, is at least reasonably unclear enough that I think other teams reach a margin on this.
Okay. So it really comes down to that claim of you don't buy their push, that there actually is a meaningful delta in terms of degree to which elections are now actually more competitive.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think they did, in my mind, give sufficient reasons in terms of why people, a large motivation for the voter apathy and the lack of participation in municipal elections that happen in status quo is specifically that people don't really care about politics, that existing parties are largely complacent because they know that they're 100% guaranteed. They told me that there's a general progressive leadership, which means that whoever is the Democratic primary candidate in the New York will 100% win the election, and that voter participation in things like Democratic primaries is much, much, much smaller. So I buy that that primaries probably act as some margin to undermine the scope of benefit that they get, but I think they do a couple of things to respond to the primary question in order to mitigate the scale of impact. One, that large national parties have a ton of influence over primaries, i.e. in terms of who they try to challenge in primaries, endorsements from national leaders, where you can get out-primaried by other candidates, why you can sort of get ousted by lack of resources from major parties, so that there is explicitly influence that large institutional parties have over primaries that it wouldn't exist on the counterfactual, which means that probably there is still not a ton of, there's a limited scope of voter representation in primaries versus an open election, and two, that voter participation in primaries is way, 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 way lower than in just municipal elections, just because they're perceived as you have to be a registered member of the party, they're explicitly partisan, they're not a general election, etc., and there's probably a limited scope in terms of that. So while primaries act as some amelioration, one, I don't think any other team talked about it to a sufficient degree, and two, I think they did structurally give us reasons as to why primaries are insufficient in terms of trying to access the comparative degree of diversity, and there is a margin in terms of diversity of discourse from other parties.
Cool. I guess just to respond quickly, I think that is convincing. My main problem is, one, I think given like the ousting or like conformity mech, I think already comes out of OG. I'm less willing to credit like the CG like version of that, which is just like, oh, like generally there's like a preemptive screening kind of that. I think that's at least the best version of that I get. I might have missed something. And then so the second version that I think they give is that people don't really vote in primaries, or like that's kind of what you said.
Yeah.
The other problem I have there is I don't think they actually say that, or at the very least, they don't tell me why they would be uninvested in primaries other than like, I guess the intuition to say, oh, well, this party is going to win anyway, I might as well not care about the primary. At least to me, that's like at a surface level pretty uncompelling, I think, given that like if their initial framing that like this party is going to win anyway is true, and the previous like conception, like not even bringing in other teams, but like generally speaking, if X is like just going to happen, it's unclear to me why the differentiation would just not be like significant enough to the point where like, I don't know, the things that they already care about, like that are proximate to them, like parks and stuff, and like those kinds of considerations wouldn't just meaningfully be fleshed out, or at least be represented in like some deviation of what that looks like.
So you can add on top of this. I think it might be more advantageous for us to start talking about the front half, see what we buy from those teams, then see where CG brings in uniquely, and then how that evaluates. But if you want to...
Oh, I just really briefly want to flag that even regardless of the primary discussion, I think there's still compelling stuff from CG about why there's just general voter apathy because they don't feel like politicians care about them under the current two-party system. There's more outreach, you get better engagement, people are more likely to care.
Correct, yeah. So there's stuff just about that are independent of the primary question. Okay, so starting with opening government. So what do we buy from opening government? I'll just, for the sake of time, say what I buy. So basically their push is that in status quo, a lot of people vote under party lines in primaries. There are some nebulous reasons why parties don't want to have more radical policy that deviates from their federal platform. I want to flag that I think OG says this, that they don't want to do things like safe injection sites, but they actually never mechanize for me why they don't want to do it. It's quite obvious, right, in that like it's going to be backlash if your party is associated with safe injection sites, which are controversial nationally, but they never say why that backlash is likely or how it manifests. So I'm willing to like undermine the degree to which I buy this claim just on the basis that they don't actually do it. They say it's controversial nationally, but they don't talk about the like underlying accountability that federal parties take for like the individual actions of mayors or whatever, right? So like that I think was a little bit undermech. And then they say, given this, you're probably going to have more options in terms of parties. You're going to have more variety in terms of the types of things that parties talk about. And then this nebulous stuff about coalitions that I think is ultimately not super well mechanized or characterized. So I think it largely sort of falls out of the debate in terms of what we get from OG. Is there anything I'm missing? Maybe the stuff about accountability, but I don't think it's super mechanized. And also the stuff about engagement is just an impact following from better policy. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think on the first thing, I think there's explicit/implicit reasoning for why you would be like kind of less averse to doing things like safe injection sites, for example, which is just to say, I think the preemptive kind of like fear of doing that when like this isn't a party norm is seen as kind of less appropriate, and I think that comes out of Claire like explicitly.
Yeah, so I guess it comes down to my question, which is like really like federal parties and national maybe like state wings of parties deviate on policy all the time, right? So like, why is it so unique in municipal politics that this is a barrier in status quo? They don't really explain that, and so why it would be overcome. And so it's just like, I think a little bit speculative other than just saying norm setting, which I think is a little relatively weak Mac.
Yeah, so I guess like, I think that's true. Like, I think while they don't prove that municipal politics can deviate from national politics, I think the version of this that they reach is that given that you exist under like a municipal paradigm, if you're going to be the person that deviates, there's like more
consequences,
of a perceived cost to doing that.
Correct, yeah. It's just like, okay, fair enough. Let's move on to OO then. What do we buy from OO? I think the OO claim was like two and a half things, right? Their claims were largely one, that you get faster and better policy, i.e. this system's complicated. National parties are pretty effective at getting things done. Like cities need to be making fast decisions, and therefore you want to have broad preferences instead of like niche complex debates where you have complex coalitions making decisions. I just didn't buy the weighing and the mechanism of this. Like, the problem with the weighing is, like, it's not clear to me that municipal decision making is actually needs to be faster than any other form of political decision making. Like, presumably, like, immigration or military intervention or tax policy, like, saves people's lives. And, like, the speculative claim of, like, whether this is actually faster or slower on the comparative, I think was, like, dubiously mech'd. The other sort of more tangible stuff was more accountability, i.e. people don't care about, like, niche, small regional politics, but when it's, like, a large national party, presumably people care about that. This is not responded to, but I think there's, like, reasonable responses to just be like, look, New York's a pretty major city. Like, people do actually care about the actions of major cities, so it undermines it just plausibly for me there. And then the final thing, decreasing voter turnout. I'm also, like, semi-skeptical about the extent to which I care about this. Like, maybe there is a margin in voter turnout to some extent. I think OG provides to me reasonable flips as to why we actually get more voter turnout when people are more enthused about parties or whatever, or they feel like they have more choice. So the only real claim that I credit meaningfully to OO is maybe some margin on accountability, and also the stuff about, like, using parties as heuristics because people are too lazy or, like, don't have time to learn about, like, the nuances of municipal parties, and there's an inability of outreach. So having, like, party heuristics is better. How do we weigh that on front half? What are our thoughts?
I can start.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I have OG over OO. I actually, I completely agree with everything you said, Rhys. My other problem with, like, the lobbying and, like, the corruption stuff is, like, I think they give, like, half the, like, capacity to do it, which is, like, the media is less kind of, like, present.
Okay.
And the flip of that is institutional party norms prevent this. I don't buy this as, like, persuasive or, like, but also, if their analysis is that coalitions are bad, it's unclear why they're capable of doing corruptions when a bunch of people, like, that exist with some degree of separation would do that.
Yeah.
But also, like, I don't know. So I think the accountability stuff is less clear to me, and the heuristic isn't, like, it doesn't reach, like, a terminal impact.
Yeah.
Other than, like, people can look at the thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Which
You maybe get some margin of representation. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's bring in. Do you have anything to add on that, Quo?
I credit OO just a little more. I think they
Okay.
do a decent job with the turnout, the voter turnout.
Yeah.
I think they do prove you get substantially more of that.
Yep.
But, like, again, unweighed how important that is. I think that neither does OG tell us too much about why they get better representation per se on their side.
Yep.
But I think, barring that unclear weighing from both sides, I'm still more likely to credit the OG stuff
Yeah,
on, like,
I think there's-
local issues, less identity politics.
Correct. And also, like, I think implicit in that is, like, given the absence of weighing, we default to the more intuitive weighing, which is just, like, more representative policy with lower turnout is presumably more important, right? Okay. Bringing in closing government, so let's do CG-OO, because I think that's quite clear. You're the only person who had CG losing to OO. We had CG beating OO. So I can give my quick claim quote also if you want to explain it. It's just basically like, I think CG gives a bunch of reasons as to why voter turnout doesn't matter in a vacuum, why parties are going to have comparative more incentives for, like, voter outreach in terms of informing voters, which was the specific mechanism that OO conceded, which was like, people aren't going to be able to learn about this. They provide solvency as to why parties have an incentive. And even if you buy that the COG claim is non-comparative, i.e. Democrats or, like, Republicans and Democrats have an incentive to do that outreach and status quo, right? They prove at the very least that it's symmetric and there's an equivalent capacity, like, there's a reasonable capacity to do it, which undermines the mechanism coming from OO, which is that you don't have the resources to do outreach. They say, no, you presumably do have the resources to do outreach. You can do fundraising in large cities. So even if it's symmetric, they still prove that this is a wash, which I think undermines the sort of primary claim that we're getting from OO in terms of turnout, symmetrizes it. And I think if we credit literally anything else from CG, that should be sufficient to outweigh what we get from OO.
cool. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. CG, OG. So Guo, do you want to do CG over OG? We already chatted about this, but let's talk about that a bit more explicitly.
Oh, I think they break the issue in front half and they explain to you why there is actually better representation. That is plainly put what it is, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Breaks the deadlock. For the same reason they beat OO in terms of breaking the deadlock on outreach and representation and the capacity for voters to be informed. I think that fills in a logical gap that is insufficient for OG to unlock their impacts, which is, I think, sufficient in my mind.
Cool. I think, so the reason I still have OG above is, one, I think the reason for why people generally are very proximate to their, like, local needs is, at least to me, intuitive enough, and I don't think is sufficiently kind of discredited or weighed against in terms of why they would be extra compelled to be, like, informed in this, like, kind of other thing. And I think like, I think my original kind of crediting of why there is more of a perceived cost than to deviating from like the prevalent sort of party vision and what that encompasses means that at the very least you get kind of a broader range of like things, not just in terms of like radical representation, but more just kind of like experimenting with like tweaking each kind of like a slider on there.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, I think OG meaningfully hits that degree of like representation more, which at the very least I think is the end point of voter turnout anyway, at least the way CG is like explaining why voter turnout matters to me. So at that point, I think the terminal impact is clear enough.
So on the first thing you said about awareness, you said that like the stuff about proximity to issues means that you're informed, which probably is a plausible mech. I think the reason that's insufficient in my mind is like people are aware of issues, but they're not aware of what politicians are offering as meaningful solutions to those issues, which is two issues that provide solvency. People care about certain things, but there's a difference between them like specifically having like the capacity to make people aware of what solutions they're offering. The other thing is, I think, while OG points out that it is possible on the alternative for politicians to provide other forms of solutions like safe injection sites, et cetera, that they aren't able to because of the repression of the Democratic Party or Republican Party above them, I think what CG is able to do is, one, they provide an alternative mechanism, maybe that's derivative, but two, I think they also provide for me, I think, a really critical link, which is why and how these smaller parties have the capacity and incentive to do those types of policies that I think is never explained from OG. So OG sort of hand waves and says they can do safe injection sites, but they don't in status quo. CG says they have a structural incentive and capacity to do things like local outreach and fundraising to outreach to like voters, et cetera, why voters are going to be informed, why they have a structural incentive and capacity to do so. And I think given that, like, it is like a relatively intuitive mech, but I think the capacity question is actually uncertain in the debate, and I think CG feeling that is actually, I think, relevant in terms of the capacity to unlock the impacts.
Okay, so I can see like the appeal of the whole like fundraising or like kind of reaching out to voters. I think OG has an independent reason that I also think is kind of credible here, where they just say that given that you're more likely to like be disaligned on each individual issue now, there is increased like discourse on each like disagreement, or at the very least like the plausible kind of things that you can do. And at that point, I think there at the very least is like, I think the second part of the issue that you were talking about, which is like the meaningful solutions or like policy, given what is proximate to them, is probably still likely to be covered in OG's paradigm. While I do think like maybe like the fundraising like part of that, or like the how much like kind of capacity do you have to dump money in to like kind of reach out to individual voters might be different. But I think my problem with that from CG is more like the capacity gap is just saying that like big cities have like fundraising, I guess. Like I don't know what the
So I'll spend like a minute or so more on this and then we'll vote. But I think the other thing is that the mechanisms you outline, things like political discourse and people having the capacity to vote in more nuanced ways, is fully non-responsive to the OO claim that people don't have the capacity or time to be informed. So the only mechanism that OG provides, like through things like discourse and like discussion on the front half clash, and this is what Guo said at the very beginning, right, is OG's mechanisms are contingent on people having the capacity and ability to be informed. OO brings a deadlock on that clash in the front half. CG breaks that deadlock, which means they're able to unlock the OG claims. So I just think, given OG's lack of responsiveness to OO on those questions, it's like quite challenging for them to be able to unlock those impacts, given that they don't ever prove that people are able to be informed.
It's like the prerequisite to having like the discussion of policy between a wide variety of politicians is like more like less voter apathy.
Correct. So it's like
I guess the like last reason that I think is here is like OG has another reason for like not being apathetic that they use in like responsiveness, but also like in preemption, which is just to say that people generally speaking will care more when they see like new kinds of like programs or like experimentation or like whatever sort of like new way of doing something that will happen. At that point, they're more likely to be invested. While I guess this wouldn't like beat a like, or while I guess it's like contestable in terms of like how busy they are, how capacity to like filter through this, I think my intuition is more likely to lean towards they have some ability to kind of like navigate these sorts of discussions like on default, I guess.
So let's vote on that and then get to our last clash. I know this is going longer than it should, but that's fine. Okay, so yeah, so vote. So who has CG beating OG? For the people listening, that's 2. Who has people has OG beating CG? 1. We're not going to reveal who voted for what, but I imagine you can guess. Okay, last clash is on OOCO. So Nimai, you have CO beating OO. We have CO in the 4. So let's give your justification for.
Cool. Okay, this one I'm actually completely amenable to. I think the thing that I end up kind of crediting to CO is just they say that there is probably an issue, at least on conception, of niche actor influence. Or kind of individual kind of interest.
Yeah.
And these are probably likely to be unproductive or at least ruin kind of some version of local politics. I think the reason that they beat OO in this claim, who I think independently kind of tries to make it, is that they say that there is an extra kind of margin on gridlock because when you have unique kind of industry related or kind of sectoral divides, you're much more likely to kind of have niche interests policy sort of issues, or at least gridlock, and at that point you're probably going to reach a greater threshold in deadlock, versus I don't think the OO version of slowing down policy proposal for the same reasons we identified earlier is plausible for me.
Yeah, so what do you want to go?
Oh, sure. I think CO is extremely uncomparative for me. I'm fully not convinced that unions are going to be the likely new political parties and candidates. So I'm not particularly convinced that anything that CO tells me is going to happen.
Yeah, so I agree. It's this very big house of cards. So it's one, unions are gonna win parties as OGPOIs. Presumably there are multiple unions with multiple competing interests.
Yeah.
So their capacity to pork barrel is probably limited. So you can't only give it to the iron industry because there's other industries. 2, it's unclear to me why unions don't have influence over domestic local municipal politics anyway in status quo. So the margin's not clear to me. 3, if they're going to be super corrupt and evil, will they get reelected? Presumably it's not clear to me, why they'll be able to do this continuously with no accountability, why they won't be sued or charged with a crime. And so for all of that, it's a little bit dubious in terms of my ability to buy any of the premises. And so just on simple weighing, maybe they say slightly there's a higher chance of institutional capture of municipal politics, which I think is a very charitable reading of the case. Is I think probably 1, it's not clear the degree to which that's comparative, and they don't really ever explain why it's comparative. 2, the scope or scale of that impact is unclear to me, versus I think the impact from OO in terms of an increase in apathy given a structural inability of parties to inform voters probably just is much clearer and a much more certain impact that is relatively clearly comparative, at least in terms of the front half of the debate. And CO never weighs meaningfully against the OO case on that clash.
Also, is a large city going to have one dominant union?
Correct.
No, yeah, sorry. Okay, so I will say the version of CO that I'm crediting isn't the union one at all, I think, because I actually, I don't think it's unions at all, but I do think there's a version of, niche kind of actor, special interest influence. That
local
I think,
heroes? Or?
Yeah, local heroes, kind of things that are more, relevant to people, industry related, whatever that might be. And so if that conception doesn't
I think that's just a very charitable reading. The best case is look, unions will have outsized influence, they're a special interest. Maybe that's true, but the only mechanism that CO provides is which that manifests is they run their own party, rather than the more nuanced mechanism of they have greater control over finance or whatever of municipal politics, which I think would be a more compelling argument, but I don't think that's the argument that CO presented, which means I can't meaningfully credit them for that.
Yeah, fair. I'm cool to.
Okay, so only one split. We have the we're going CG, OG, OO, CO.